I'm Thierry Heles. This is The Next Leap. "2025 marks 100 years since the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation became the first ever tech transfer office. It has been a very successful first century for the nonprofit organization, but that does pose an interesting question. How can WARF keep innovating and make sure it not only survives but thrives for at least another 100 years? The organization is certainly not resting on its laurels. WARF today is split into 6 verticals, and much like you'd expect, some of those are groundbreaking, like WARF Therapeutics, a drug development accelerator run by just a handful of people that has already brought tens of millions of additional grant funding to the UW-Madison campus. This is part 2 of our mini-series on WARF, so you can listen to this one first, but you might gain more from the conversation if you have the historical context from part 1, so I recommend catching up first. My guests today are Eric Iverson, who became CEO of WARF in 2016. Eric is deeply passionate about life sciences, having earlier worked for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and also joining us is Mike Parch, WARF's inaugural Chief Venture Officer, whose CV includes founding the first ever biotech spinout out of Penn in 1990. Mike, Eric, welcome.
Nice to be here. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it very much. Looking forward to our conversation.
Same here. Eric, let's start with you. You're the CEO. You came to WARF in 2016. You previously were president of the Infectious Disease Research Institute. And before that, you worked with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. What attracted you to WARF? What brought you to this organization?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Terry. It really stems back from my days at the Gates Foundation, where we certainly developed a lot of technologies or supported the development of a lot of technologies. And we built relationships with universities around the world, many of which in the US, but also many in the UK. And I came to appreciate, with no reason to have any bias, because I was expecting to live my life out in Seattle, particularly in the biotech community. But I really noted that there were 3 universities I thought, and many of my colleagues thought, were very good at managing technologies for many reasons. Very good at it. And I noted it was MIT, Stanford, and this place called WARF at the University of Wisconsin. They were all 3 were just really at the top of their game and understanding the dynamic nature of protecting and putting into the hands of industry partners technologies to develop them into products. And it was just truly a coincidence that one of those 3, WARF, of course, gave me a call back in 2015 or so, asking if I'd be interested in the CEO position. And of course, that then prompted the story of going through the process and receiving the honor to come and run WARF starting back in July of 2016.
Amazing. I like that it was almost coincidental. If MIT had called, you would have quite happily also gone to MIT. Who wouldn't, to be fair? Who wouldn't?
Yeah.
But great that you landed at WARF. Outside of WARF, you're a passionate advocate for global access to medicines. Among your engagement, you are also on expert committees for the WHO. How does that outside perspective add value to your work at WARF? And maybe conversely, how does WARF inform those engagements you have?
Yeah, we'll start certainly on the WARF side. At the University of Wisconsin, we hold true to this concept of the Wisconsin idea, where the boundaries of the campus extend well beyond the campus and into the state, but also we push those boundaries into the well-being of the country and the world. And certainly being a global citizen, carrying out a lot of activities at the Gates Foundation and the Infectious Disease Research Institute, which is really a vaccine development organization for neglected diseases. I've spent a lot of my career traipsing around the world, building partnerships in developed countries and developing countries. And when I came to WARF, I thought it was quite important to take that ethos or that philosophy and extend that Wisconsin idea to the extent we can to bring technologies to people throughout the state, throughout the country, throughout the world. And so I believe in that very strongly. And the access to medicines, there's various constituencies within that realm. Some feel strongly that patent or IP coverage of technologies is really the evil of technology access. I believe quite opposite. I think strong intellectual property coverage is important. It's what's helped the economic development and vibrancy and employment and production throughout the United States, but also throughout Europe and other places. And I believe really it comes down to how one manages that intellectual property to partner it with others to bring discoveries into the innovation sphere, innovation into product sphere, products into the market. Intellectual property coverage to me is an incentive and a vehicle. And then it's all about relationships. And that's where, in building a venture fund internally and hiring Mike to run that fund, it's really about relationships. And that fundamentally, I believe, is the basis of Wharf's activities as well, generally.
That makes complete sense. Yeah. Mike, you became Wharf's inaugural Chief Venture Officer in 2018. Before that, I think you were a co-founder and CEO of several businesses, including co-founding a startup out of Penn. So you really got into this whole thing really early on in your career. Neos Technologies, which then obviously went to IPO in 96. What brought you to Wharf?
You hit upon something. I started my first company, or helped start my first company, as a 19-year-old sophomore at Penn. And that company ended up going public. And that got me hooked. I really loved the excitement, the energy, the innovation of university-based startup. It was my first exposure to two critical components of that ecosystem, that being tech transfer and venture capital. I never knew what a tech transfer office was. This was in the late 80s, early 90s when we started Neos. And so the Bayh-Dole Act was still pretty new across the country. We were, I believe, the first biotech to spin out of Penn. And I just loved that vibrant energy. And I decided to make a career change. I was planning to go to medical school, but I pivoted and went to get a business degree, got into venture capital, interfaced with a number of tech transfer offices around the country, including Wharf, 20 years before I came to work here. And I was really impressed because the other tech transfer offices I'd worked with, they were all within the university. There was a tremendous amount of bureaucracy. Visiting Wharf, it was a nonprofit, separate entity from the university, much more industry focused, market focused. I didn't get the sense that I was in an academic setting. I got the sense that I was in a startup factory. And that was back in around 1999, 2000. I went on to California, worked at a couple of venture funds out there, started some more companies. And one day, a friend of mine from Ann Arbor called and he said, you're going to get a phone call from a guy named Eric Iverson at Wharf, and I suggest you take that call. So I was intrigued. I was like, I remembered Wharf from back in the day, and he called and he said, we're looking for somebody to be our inaugural chief venture capital officer. And we want someone who's created a venture fund, somebody who's created a university startup with a positive exit, and somebody who understands tech transfer. And I had started several companies with positive exits. I'd created a venture fund, and I interfaced with a number of tech transfer offices, marrying someone who's in Stanford's tech transfer office. One could say I checked all three of those boxes. My wife and I flew to Madison, fell in love with Madison. I loved the Wharf ecosystem, the ability that Wharf has to be at one within the university environment, close proximity to these cutting edge researchers, brilliant minds, and yet separate. We have our own resources, our own capital. We interface with the university on many levels with many different touch points. But we have a lot of freedom and creativity to innovate the way we transfer technology, innovate the way we commercialize that technology. And I just thought, that's pretty cool. What all can we do? And we have, I'm sure we'll talk about it in a bit, we have some really cool initiatives. And we're able to do things that I don't think many other universities around the world can do. So it was pretty intriguing.
Oh, I think you definitely do. And we will get to some of those in a second. What are maybe some of the lessons that you learned in your career today that you are applying today at Wharf, or maybe knowledge that you want to impart to Wharf's entrepreneurs?
Well, one of the big ones, having dealt with academic inventors, founders of companies at a number of universities, one of the big lessons I've learned is you've got to understand that your creation, your baby, this one molecule, this one neuronal pathway, or this one engineering component, this thing that you spent your entire life on, that you're the world's expert on, is only one component of what makes a startup successful. That innovation, you may be the world's expert on that component of it, but that doesn't mean that that is the most valuable asset in a startup company. In the beginning, you need to have the intellectual property protected. As Eric said, it's very important, critical to have the IP protected. But a great idea ain't going to get you very far in the startup world. So the lesson I would have that's most important to me is to communicate to these inventors. Remember, the invention is just the beginning of the process. It might be the end of your scientific inventive process, getting to that answer, but it's just the beginning of creating a product in a technology startup company. You've got to bring in business expertise. I don't recommend academic founders be CEOs. I have not seen many of them be able to make that transition. Many inventors figure, I'm a neurosurgeon. I mastered that. I can master business. That doesn't work out too well. You've got to bring in capital. You've got to bring in commercialization experts. And, the IP is one piece of that critical big puzzle, all these interconnected pieces that have to be put together in the right places, in the right order.
academic researchers shouldn't be CEOs. I think that's a lesson that is hard learned in a lot of places, probably. Let's look at how Wharf operates today then. The organization is actually split into 6 enterprises: Wharf IP and licensing, Wharf Therapeutics, Wharf Ventures, investments portfolio management, granting, and then real estate development and operations. How did you develop that specific structure for Wharf?
Largely strategically, partly opportunistically. When I started at Wharf, it was largely a patent and licensing entity. And we had made a series of grants to campus around stem cells with a professor, Jamie Thompson, who isolated human embryonic stem cells, became the basis of what has been a multi-decade regenerative medicine play that we've had here on campus. Wharf has provided substantial support. So when I arrived, we had our patent and licensing operations, but we also owned a very large building, or the majority of a large building on campus. And that's the real estate we manage that, or have historically for sure. But what I noted was, and the board, and part of their hiring somebody from outside of Wisconsin, I came here from Seattle, was what other things can we put into place to supercharge dynamically the management, development, and commercialization of technologies. During my time at the Gates Foundation, I had helped set up their venture fund. I'm not a venture capitalist. I needed a professional, hence Mike is here. But I also recognized, having spent time in the life science space, that we could do very little for the medical school, who are phenomenal researchers, world class, and they're studying disease states, and particularly potential druggable targets within those disease states. So, for example, a unique protein expressed by a particular cancer, and whether you could shut down that particular protein, would it then kill the cancer cells? That would be a druggable target. That is not patentable. That is a naturally occurring biological phenomenon. And so had noted to the board that if we're going to serve the medical school in large part, then we had better create a mechanism to develop drugs against those biological targets. And that's largely what the pharmaceutical industry does, is they comb the papers coming out of academia that is focusing on these potential druggable targets. And then with that information, they validate those targets and build drugs, whether it's a small molecule, an antibody, whatever it might be. So persuaded the board that we have a substantial amount of resources under management. And over 100 years, this year is our 100-year anniversary of Wharf, we have built up a significant amount of money that we manage. And so we are, in fact, a investment management shop with a few $1 billion under management. So that is part of the business that we run. At the time of getting here, we run this building and we run this IP licensing shop. I asked the board for significant resources to stand up a venture fund so we can support the spin out of companies, but I also asked for significant resource to be able to do drug development. And the condition there was not to build a bricks and mortar biotech company, but to do it largely virtual, where we'd have a very small team that leverages contract research organizations around the world to run the assays and help with the iterative process of designing drugs and synthesizing them, doing the studies and going through that process. So we have stood up an internal venture fund that is led by Mike. We have stood up an internal drug development team run by a guy named John Young. And then we also have an accelerator program, but not accelerator from the perspective of an incubator for startups, an accelerator program from the perspective of taking these new inventions that are in their gestational phase. And if we put some resource behind those inventions with the advice of industry experts, it has to be all led by industry because they're the ones who might buy the technology, that we put resources behind that to mature the technologies to pilot stage or additional data, that if we achieve those outcomes over a year or 2 years, then that technology will become more ripe to hand over to the licensing team to either give to a big company or to start a startup. That startup then is supported by Mike's team through the ventures activities. That's exactly how we do this drug development side. So on one hand, we have these multiple verticals, but the secret and the very difficult part, but we are a very strong group of management team. I would take my management team everywhere and anywhere. The trick is with these verticals, they all have to have their own high level of professionalism and activities, but they all have to interact with each other to leverage each other's respective strengths. And it's quite dynamic. But at this point, I think we're operating very, very well and very strongly at pulling all these different lines of business together, what we call a one Wharf approach.
There's 2 that I want to look at in more detail, and you mentioned them obviously, one being Wharf Therapeutics and the other being Wharf Ventures. Maybe starting with Wolf Therapeutics, can you tell me a little bit more about why this is such a unique model among tech transfer offices?
Sure. I'll start this and then I'll hand it over to Mike. Mike and I work very closely in helping to work with and provide oversight support to that therapeutics team. There is a number of universities, let's say there's 15 or 20 of them in the United States, who have stood up a drug development group within the university. It doesn't typically reside within the tech transfer office, but a university will stand up a drug development to do exactly what I had just described, which is your scientists who are identifying potential druggable targets, but then they needed a mechanism to build drugs around that. And vast majority have stood it up with bricks and mortar and large teams. It could be in the dozens, it could be in the hundreds of people. And it's oftentimes resourced by very wealthy alumni or by the state, perhaps, or both, that would put a couple $100 million to work within this drug development program. And they have a very large staff to do most of everything that goes onto the drug development program. What we said is we wanted that to be virtual. So we hired only 3 people to run it. Right. Thanks. I appreciate that response.
Others have hundreds, and then I thought, maybe fewer people, but 3, that's a huge difference. Yeah.
That's right. So we have John Young who runs it, and then we have a head of chemistry and a head of biology, Brian and Hung Min. And what they do as a team is they work with campus, have ongoing meetings to identify potential targets. Largely, they fall within oncology, but we also look at CNS, we look at cardiovascular. We're willing to look at all areas. We focused initially on small molecules. These 3, John, Brian, and Hung Min, have collectively 70 to 80 years of pharmaceutical experience. Most of that was at Merck. And so their process is identifying the high-value potential targets. Then they've stood up a scientific advisory board, all of whom are industry experts. There's about 10 of them, give or take, all of whom have spent their careers at biotech and pharma. And so they advise us as to the stage gate processes and have to approve going from one large stage to the next preclinically to design the drugs, to identify those that are lead candidates, then to optimize them. And then once you get through the optimization, you then go into IND enabling so that you can go into first in human. This has been in the works for 6 years now, 7 years now. Our board committed $50 million to this program. Only $21 million to date have been spent, and this team has been incredibly prolific. With these 3, then they've taken a licensing person, John. He's been brought in. So now it's a team of 4. We have 3 scientists, 1 business development, a strong scientific advisory board, and a group of contract research organizations globally, who are the contract research organizations that the big pharma, the GSKs, the Mercks, the Pfizers, AstraZeneca's, these. So we have pharmaceutical trained professionals, small team, using pharmaceutical grade SAB or scientific advisory board, using pharmaceutical biotech grade contract research organizations to design these drugs. Our pipeline is about 7, give or take, projects, but we've just achieved the first lead asset, which is a radiopharmaceutical, into IND enabling studies. That then is followed by the second lead asset, which is a PROTAC, a new modality that we are now in stage 4. We expect to be done with that by the end of the calendar year. That would be poised to go into IND enabling. Incredibly efficient, incredibly productive, very small, almost wholly virtual team of experts. What's happened now is we've approached that point of potential monetization and partnership of these assets. That's where Mike's team comes in, where because we want to explore partnering that with a company, but also it might be that we would put it into a new startup biotech company and work with the venture funds. And that's where my engagement within the therapeutics program has really allowed us to take that really to the next level of activities.
Amazing. Mike, tell me more.
Yeah. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we're doing on the business development side. But before I do, there's a critical component, I think, that I'd like to add to what Eric said about sort of the background and the functioning of Wharf Therapeutics. So not only has this brilliantly creative team been very efficient with the capital that has been invested into the program to date to get not 1, but 2 candidates, lead candidates, just about ready for licensing, 1 in negotiation stage and 1 just on the cusp. But we've also been able to attract new grants to the campus, new development grants to researchers on the campus that they would not have been eligible to get but for the fact that Wharf Therapeutics existed for them to be able to translate their academic research into a drug discovery program. And the total of the grants, I don't remember off the top of my head, but it's more than 40 or 50 million, I think, by this point. Correct, Eric?
Yeah, it'll soon be approaching an extra $100 million
Wow.
in new grants to campus.
So the university suddenly gets $100 million of additional research grants, federally funded research grants, because of Wharf Therapeutics' existence and the ability of these researchers to translate their academic research into a drug discovery program. And that to me is just a huge bonus to university. It just takes UW-Madison, a great university already, and it like gives them this whole new program into which they can flourish. So it's really impressive. So as Eric mentioned, on the business development side, we're taking a dual approach. We're looking at directly licensing the lead asset, the radiopharmaceutical, to industry. And that could be the largest of the large pharmaceutical companies. I won't name names, but the biggest of the big, all the way down through mid-sized biopharma to small biotech startups, venture-backed biotech startups. We've talked about 50 groups in that spectrum.
Okay.
But in parallel, we've started talking to some of the top venture creation funds that, are the company builders, the Versants, the flagships of the world, if you will. With the idea being that, we may want to have the optionality to take that asset and go to the first in man studies and increase the value, get to a higher inflection point for the value creation, and then turn around and create a build to buy, which is bought by a pharma. So we wanted to bake in that optionality and look at both paths. And I have to say, the initial discussions we've had with pharma, they've been immensely impressed with the data package that we present. I've had heads of search and evaluation teams tell us that the data package we present is as good or better than any of the biotechs they deal with. It's something that they expect to see within their own development team.
Amazing.
It's that level. And it's what you would expect. We're using the same CROs. We're using industry experts from Merck to put together this data package. So the quality of the output of Wharf Therapeutics has been just rock solid. And that's been a critical factor, I think, in the success Wharf Therapeutics has had so far in attracting attention for a licensing partner. Because if you talk to a lot of these search and evaluation teams, which we have, you learn, and I actually learned this firsthand, it's very difficult to duplicate what's done in academic labs. Sometimes, despite the academic rigor that researchers put into their work, when you take a technology out and try to duplicate it in your own lab or in industry, things don't always work. And one of the critical components of John Young, the head of Wharf Therapeutics, one of the critical components of John's process is before he does any drug discovery work, he validates it. He does his own external work with the CRO to validate that technology, that target that was done on campus, so that we start off knowing that we have something that we can build upon. And it's not reliant on the academic researchers who just aren't the same as the industry pharma teams, their own development teams. So that's a critical component of John's therapeutic process at Wharf Therapeutics.
It makes complete sense that that is the approach, but I think it is ingenious that that is the model that you've landed on, because it's probably not something that other universities or tech transfer offices maybe think about or maybe have the resources to think about. Yeah, it's not something that I've come across, and if they have the resources, it's because maybe they have partnered with someone like Deerfield that comes in and brings those resources to the university.
The brilliance, I think, of what they've done when they set up Wharf Therapeutics is the complete virtualness that they've created, as Eric said. We don't have any steel in the ground. We didn't build labs. We didn't hire 100 people. We have 3 scientists, one in Madison, John, the head of it. We have one in Boston and one in San Diego, other bio hotbeds. We have our fingers in the right places academically. We're virtual, and we're able to put the capital that we are spending towards the outsourced CROs and our relationships.
Yeah, that is a really, really cool model, and that others will hopefully be able to learn from as well. The other thing that I wanted to look at in more detail is Wharf Ventures, which I think is your remit, Mike.
Yes.
We'll stay on you, and maybe can you tell me a little bit more about that?
So we are about a $200 million asset under management venture fund. Wharf has been doing direct venture investing for 25 years. As I mentioned earlier in my career as a venture capitalist, I interacted with Wharf looking at technologies back in 1999, and they were doing direct venture investing then. I was looking at co-investing alongside them in one of their startup companies. So they have a long history of doing venture capital around their technologies, but there wasn't a dedicated team. It wasn't someone's full-time job, and there wasn't someone who had been sort of trained in venture process professionally. And so whenever I got recruited, I was allowed to build a team from several folks within Wharf. I built a solid team of bright folks, an engineer who helps me on the due diligence with the engineering technologies that we look at. I've got a PhD molecular biologist who really takes the lead on the life science projects. We've got an analyst who is rock solid and extremely creative. So we built this team with a tremendous amount of resources behind it. It's a small team, $200 million, but we have the entire Wharf IP and licensing machinery that we can tap into. So when we have to do technical due diligence on the IP, we don't have to start from scratch as I would normally have to do at a venture fund. I just walk down the hall and talk to the head of IP and licensing or the licensing manager or the IP manager directly related to that technology. And I can get all the information I need on the patent portfolio, the picket fence around the technology, the competing patents that are out there, the market size, who are the major players in the space, all of the critical stuff that you need when a venture capital fund is making decisions. So we have that resource, that machinery that Wharf has built over 100 years, that institutional know-how right there down the hall that we're able to tap into and bring to it. And we need that resource because unlike a lot of the specialized venture funds that we have today, our investment thesis is so narrow. It's only what comes off of University of Wisconsin-Madison's campus, the technologies that are created there. So we have to be willing and able to look at and invest in life sciences, but also quantum computing, fusion energy, ag tech, software products, apps. It's across the board. So we have to have the resources available to us and the flexibility to look at all these different industry segments and make investment decisions in them. Now, we have a process that we go through on our diligence, and we operate very much like one of the coastal venture capital funds. We instill that discipline that it has to be a good investment opportunity. It can't just be, this is a great professor, Nobel Prize winner, they bring in lots of research grants, so we all like him, we have to invest in his or her company. No. In fact, when I was being interviewed by one of the Wharf trustees, they asked me, are you going to be comfortable saying no to a world famous researcher who wants to start a company? And I said, my entire career, I've had to be able to perfect the art of telling somebody that their baby is ugly, but do it in a way so that when they have a pretty baby, they still bring it to me to look at. Because that's the trick. These are brilliant researchers you're dealing with, and their first idea may not be the one that you're going to invest in, but you don't want to burn bridges. You have to be able to educate them about what it is you're looking for, what's going to make a viable product in the marketplace. Going back to what I said earlier, that invention is just one piece of a bigger puzzle. And so being able to communicate that to the researchers, that's something that we've really worked at honing our skills at. Another critical thing we've done is we invest in Madison, Wisconsin. Our companies can go anywhere, but we don't have a ton of venture capital around us here. So we've really made a strong effort, a huge effort to build bridges to the coast.
Okay.
And globally, we have investors that we interface with around the world. One of my colleagues just spent a week in Japan because it turns out we have 7 portfolio companies that have investors from Japan. And we're probably going to do a Wharf trip over there to build those bridges even stronger. So we've made this concerted effort to tap into the investment pools of capital on the coast and around the world and bring those investment dollars to technologies coming out of Madison. Now, we don't have to build the companies in Madison. The companies can go wherever it makes sense. But we want to tap into those dollars so that we bring deep pockets, deeper than our own, and industry knowledge and connections. Because as I said, we have this broad spectrum of investments we have to make of the different technologies. We can't be experts in all of them. So we need to have a co-investor who's got those deep pockets and the industry know-how and connections within each of those market verticals that we invest. So that's a requirement that we have. And Wharf, despite its success venture investing in the past, they didn't always do that. We found ourselves sometimes as the deepest pockets at the table. And it's an uncomfortable position when you have an extended period of time where there's not a lot of venture funding flowing. So now we require deep pockets at the table with us. So we're in there with other solid, financially motivated investors. When I joined Wharf, we had about 7 outside dollars for every dollar that we invested in our portfolio companies. Right now, those numbers are around 15 to 17 outside dollars for every dollar that we have invested. So we look at that as a testament to, one, the outreach that we have done to external investors, bigger investors on the coast writing bigger checks, but 2, the attractiveness of the technology startups that we are creating. We've always said we're not going to compete trying to make the most university startups a year. It's not a quantity play, it's a quality play. When we make an investment, it's because we think this is a solid company, and the 17-to-1 outside co-investment, that helps validate that we have a product that others want to invest in.
That is a phenomenal metric. And yeah, I think it's very wise to say it's not about, league tables of who creates the most startups, because I think sometimes that is the focus, maybe not necessarily in universities, but certainly from government perspective. It's, we need more startups, but 30 startups that employ 20 people and make no money aren't worth much. Whereas if you have one that raises 500 million and is a blockbuster drug, worth way more. There was one other aspect that I find interesting about Wharf, and that is that you are also active in real estate, which I think is something that other funds maybe are trying to do now. I know Oxford Science Enterprises here in the UK has gotten into real estate. Do you have any big plans for that? Is that just something that you've historically done? What's your views on this?
We're going to be very strategic as to how we approach that. But we've also had a long history ebbing and flowing in and out of real estate, but maybe not for the reasons you might think. That is, being a nonprofit organization supporting the University of Wisconsin-Madison, periodically we receive donations. And some decades ago, Wharf received a massive donation of what is called the Wisconsin Dells. It's like the Las Vegas of water parks, not too far away from here. And you would say, well, what the heck is a tech transfer office doing with that? It just became part of the portfolio that generated some revenue, and we ultimately wound up selling it. What we really do in the real estate space, though, is we support the campus in the terms of grants as they build new, largely scientific buildings, the new chemistry building, new engineering building, new computer science building, etc. Over time, though, we've also helped build out housing because, of course, you need to be able to house your students and your faculty. And so we've provided funding in other areas with respect to apartments and other things. But over the past couple of decades, to a lower degree. The biggest, and really it was a pivot for us about 15 years ago, is putting substantial funds into what is referred to as Discovery Building in the middle of campus. And as part of that, the state put in some dollars. And the Morbridge family, John and Tasha Morbridge, John Morbridge was effectively the founding CEO of Cisco Systems in the Bay Area. He is a graduate of University of Wisconsin, and his wife Tasha are Wisconsinites. They have been real significant donors to this campus, and they put a significant amount of money into the Discovery Building, but also we stood up inside of that what's called the Morbridge Institute for Research, which is a private institute like the Whitehead Institute at Harvard. And so as a result of us using our capital to help the campus in all sorts of dynamic and creative ways, we put a lot of money into this Discovery Building and wound up owning 70% of it. And then we took on the task of managing that building and running programming within that building. That is symposia and all sorts of other things. Now, one might say that is really odd for a technology transfer office to manage a building.
It is.
And on one level, it just doesn't make any sense. But on the other hand, Wharf is very flexible. We are independent from the campus, so we're able to put our resources to work. We're able to hire people and put them to work in a very dynamic and speedy way that perhaps the university, which is a state institution, just can't be that quick and flexible. But it is a little odd for us to be in the middle of this massive campus with its own facilities team and departments that run certainly many dozens of buildings and the overall infrastructure, yet this tech transfer office is running a building and, quite frankly, a vivarium associated with that building. And so I think over time, whether we're going to stay in that business or not, I think is everything needs to be on the table all the time. And we need to operate this organization in a strategic, cohesive, and logical fashion to carry out our core competency of technologies to the marketplace. And so far, with having programming where we can convene people, present things in the Discovery Building, it's been really useful. And us supporting the standing up of the Morbridge Institute for Research, we should do nothing but celebrate that because it's added strength to campus. But I'm guessing over time we'll evolve from that. The only reason we'd really be doing that is to say that we've stood up this magnificent building and all things associated with that, hand that over to somebody else, the campus, and then move on to our next big thing. Because we're constantly looking for the next dynamic, big difference-making mechanism, whether it's standing up a venture fund, standing up a drug development program, standing up this magnificent building in the middle of campus and all that goes on within it, helping stand up the Morbridge Institute. We're regularly looking for how do we execute against something that is complementary and supercharging, while at the same time having exit strategies so that we can stand it up, get it going, hand it over to the campus or the Morbridge Institute, moving on to the next thing that we're going to do.
And that very neatly leads me on to my next question, which is, and you've touched on this, it's the centennial for Wharf this year, founded in 1925, first tech transfer office in the US certainly, and maybe even in the world. Perhaps the obvious question then is, how do you stay relevant for the next 100 years, which I realize is a really big question.
That is the question. And it is the question that we have to ask ourselves every year. And we measure our activities, you have to in the tech transfer space, because you're dealing with inventions. By definition, it's a hatched idea. And to get something to the point of being a technology, it takes years and years and years, and then taking it to the marketplace, protecting it in the marketplace. So we really think of things in the terms of decades. But that question that you pose, which is exactly the dead center of what we need to constantly ask ourselves, is what brought us to the point from where I started to where we are today, saying to ourselves, industry doesn't want newly hatched ideas. They want newly hatched ideas that have been baked a little bit longer and have been de-risked, and other people have put their dollars in to prove that the market cares about it. And so that's the reason why we created the drug discovery program. That's why we created the ventures program. That's why we've really put resource behind our accelerator program. So we're constantly asking ourselves that question and then going to our board of directors, which is independent of the university. And they're largely entrepreneurs, very, very successful. They're business leaders, they're policy makers. And it's a board of 13, so it's a relatively small board, but they're constantly challenging us on that front. And then as we come up with ideas, and just as of late, we've come up with some new concepts that we want to test, that our board will challenge us, will help us evolve a strategy. And it's up to them as to whether they're going to unleash the resources that we have at our disposal to put those to work in the ways that we have. So we're constantly asking, and we have to ask ourselves those questions. And quite frankly, every tech transfer office and every company should be asking those questions of themselves on an ongoing basis.
Yeah. Mike, you touched on this earlier. I think you mentioned Japan. How does Wolf see itself developing these international partnerships going forward?
Well, it's a challenge, and it's not easy. If it was easy, everybody would be doing it already. But I think to the point you both already made, that's how you maintain relevancy for the next 100 years, is finding a way to build those relationships. So it's on a technology by technology basis. I have my team go and attend scientific conferences, investment conferences, pretty much in the US, but we've gone internationally as well. Bio, especially. I've been, myself, I was over at Bio Europe this past spring. I'll probably be over there again next year as well. You make those connections at those conferences. My colleague who went to Japan recently, he's working in the quantum computing space, and it turns out one of the largest and smartest investors in that space he met at a conference, and they're over in Japan. And so he took the opportunity to go over and meet with them when they were having a quantum computing conference over in Tokyo. And so he went over there and met with some of the thought leaders around the world in quantum computing. And if it means you have to get on a plane and go across an ocean, that's what you've got to do. In this virtual world, we've all learned to make Zoom phone calls and communicate that way, and that is highly efficient. But I've always believed that at certain moments, you need to be somewhere. You need to be boots on the ground, hands on the action. You need to sometimes be where that action is. And we take that to heart. And so we work at maintaining those relationships. It's not easy. It means travel. It means constant communication and staying in touch.
I'll add on to this as well. And that is, there's nothing linear about our business. There's very little that's linear in any business, but in technology transfer, not only are we thinking about the technologies that come off campus, how to protect them and commercialize them, but we're working within a political system that's not always friendly. And I don't mean in an unfriendly or adversarial way. I mean in the sense of the challenges that they throw at it. And a couple examples of that. One is in the Bayh-Dole Act, which really is the seminal act that allows campuses to own their inventions and patent them and then commercialize them.
Yes, yeah.
But there is a march-in right. If it is not being commercialized in a certain way, the government have the ability to step in and take a compulsory license to it. And there is an ongoing, this happens not just in the US, but this is global. This is the access to medicines things that I used to grapple with at the Gates Foundation, which is the desire for certain constituents or countries to march in, take the rights, and have manufacturing local, or they hope would be a lower price. The other aspects that are at play, certainly in the US, and I trust that you're hearing a lot about it, is made in America. The desire not to have things made in other countries, but to build the manufacturing sectors in the United States so that products that are sold in the United States are really made here. And much of what we do is you try to build partnerships globally. Part of that, those partners want to make it, whether it's in South Korea or the UK or India or wherever it might be. It's not just the new administration coming in, but the existing ones are saying, we really want more of this made in the United States. And so you need, if it's funded by the US government, you need to get waivers from the US government to allow it to be made outside the US. And that's becoming more difficult. And so on one hand, the US really prides itself in helping other countries in all sorts of ways and having a really fluid economic set of relationships through treaty and otherwise, while at the same time imposing laws or policies that really make that extraordinarily difficult. And so we have a very small but strong group within WARF and the university constantly in contact with our congressional delegation and talking about what the issues are in order for us to carry out our commitment to the university to get these technologies into the hands of people around the world, to get them developed and made. That's one thing that I don't want to lose sight of because it is quite complicated.
Especially with marching rights, I know that discussion flared up again. There are a lot of very strong voices that have very strong opinions, not necessarily the right opinions. So it's good to hear that it's something that you keep on top of and that you're engaging your representative and making sure that Washington thinks the way that they should think. Is there anything that WARF itself isn't doing, maybe not well, but maybe something needs to focus on or something that's still missing from the piece? Or are you quite happy with the 6 enterprises that you have now?
I guess we're never satisfied and we're constantly challenging ourselves. And that's part of what I take great pride and joy in the sense of having super smart people around me as the CEO who are leaders in their own right, but everybody throughout the entire organization. But then we're here to support thousands and thousands of world-class researchers. And so the great honor and joy is to spend time with them and ask that question. What aren't we doing? What could we do better? And we also pride ourselves in building those relationships with industry, whether it's the venture side or companies or startups, and asking them exactly the same question. What can we do better? What are we doing that we just aren't doing very well? And there might be reasons why we're not doing it very well. That is, we have constituents all over the place, from policymakers in the middle of the state who, because we're a capital city, to our congressional delegation, to the academic researchers, to the industry. We're trying to balance all of that and bring it all together. And so in doing that, it means that we just can't dam the torpedoes straight ahead, right? We have to actually mind the torpedoes. So there are some things that I think we're beginning to explore, whether we're going to put extra emphasis in certain areas of research or priority technology areas. But also there's some budding areas such as AI, big data sets. And I don't think we or, quite frankly, any tech transfer office has figured out how to best protect and, to the extent appropriate, monetize those activities. We certainly are going to have to give that a lot of thought and time and collaboration with outsiders, subject matter experts, to help us really think that through well.
Yeah. I think Mark Sadam at New York University is one person that talks a lot about the impact of AI and really has a lot of interesting views of how it will change tech transfer, possibly, in the years to come. We are almost out of time, but let's end this on a positive note. Are there emerging research areas that you are particularly excited about for the coming years or maybe even decades?
Mike, I'll give you the first stab at that.
The thing I've really loved about my career in startups, and I'm aging myself here by showing, I've been doing it 35 years, is you almost don't know what that next big wave is going to be. You get the first hint of it when you start seeing these invention disclosures coming in. But I guess if I were to pick a couple of them, I'm very excited about AI. I think there is a lot of potential there. I want to be careful how I say this. I mean, there's a lot of hype around it right now. I think there's a lot of potential when people start to figure out how to implement AI in local systems, not requiring huge data centers. I think that's going to be very powerful. When companies start to figure out how to implement it in everyday life of people, we're going to see huge boons in quality of life as well as efficiency. So I'm excited about the potential for AI, specifically in areas of healthcare. We're real excited about radiotherapeutics. It's a hot area right now in the pharmaceutical world. Wisconsin has the top medical physics program in the world. So we happen to be sort of at ground zero of what's going on in radiotherapeutics. We've got a couple of isotope manufacturers right down the road. GE Medical's here in town as well. So we have a lot of the pieces in place to really capitalize on the exciting radiotherapeutics market. So that's one that I find real exciting.
Amazing. Eric?
Yeah, certainly radioisotope, radiopharmaceuticals, theranostics. Madison could be the center of the universe in that space. I strongly believe that, given our capabilities. We have the world's leading med physics program. Beyond that, ag tech, we're an agricultural state, and the amount of technologies being developed that come out of engineering and computer science for purposes of such things as sensors for water management, crop management, those kinds of activities. The two big ticket areas that will take multiple decades, but really there's some near-term applications, are both in the energy space, particularly fusion and fission. A lot of activities in Wisconsin, super strong in that space. And the idea that we're investing venture dollars into that leaves some people scratching their heads, wondering if we can get a venture return within a venture relevant period of time. But we're beginning to see some real movement there, and Wisconsin is very strong. The last bit is quantum computing, very similar to the fusion fission side, which is it's a long horizon, but we're seeing some really incredible advancements, incremental, that will matter a whole lot in bringing this to fruition. So there's some really big, exciting areas. And then medical imaging, GE Healthcare is right down the road, very strong relationship with them, again, because of our med physics program. So a lot of big ticket, high tech areas. Yeah, those are the areas.
Amazing. Well, Madison, Wisconsin, definitely places to very, very closely watch now and certainly in the years to come as well. Eric, Mike, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today. It's been a huge pleasure.
Been a pleasure. Thank you.
Terry, it's been an honor. Thank you for allowing us to be on your show.
The Next Leap is hosted and produced by me, Thierry Heles. Jenna Clark is the graphic designer and Alex White is the composer. If this is your first time listening, make sure to hit that follow or subscribe button. And if you enjoyed the show, please give us a rating and share it with your colleagues. That is the best way to help the podcast grow. If you have any feedback or are interested in being a guest on a future episode, you can email me at thierry@thenextleap.is, that's thierry@thenextleap.is, or message me on LinkedIn. And hey, did you know that The Next Leap isn't just a podcast, but also a media and data research consultancy for tech transfer? So if you'd like to work together or find out more about how I could help, shoot me an email on that same address, thierry@thenextleap.is. Next week, I'll be chatting with Stuart Wilkinson, the Chief Executive of Knowledge Exchange UK, about the future of the sector in Britain and the profession more broadly. There's even going to be candy, and what that's all about, well, you'll just have to subscribe and listen. Until then, thank you for listening today, or as we say back home in Luxembourg, merci, dass ihr gelauscht habt.